Hello, my name is Sadie. My own mother pushed my kids out of their room, said the golden grandson deserved the best space upstairs. While I was working 12-hour shifts to keep food on the table, she shoved my children into the basement like they didn't belong. I came home to find them crying, asking me if they even mattered. And as I held them, I wondered, how far would my own family go to erase us? When I first pulled the car into my mother's driveway that spring afternoon, Houston's air was heavy with the scent of cut grass and the faint sweetness of magnolia. My two children, Avon and Zinnia, sat quietly in the back seat, their backpacks resting against their legs. I remember forcing a smile as I turned to them, telling them this was just a temporary step until we found a place of our own. Their eyes brightened with a kind of hope that only children could hold on to after such upheaval. Walking up the familiar steps, the chipped paint on the railing stirred something in me. It was the same house where I had grown up, yet it no longer felt entirely mine. When the door opened, my mother, Seraphine, greeted us with a stiff embrace. She looked past me almost immediately and bent down to hug the children. "It'll be nice having you here, for a little while," she said. "Just until you get back on your feet." The words were polite enough, but I felt the sting behind them. They reminded me that this wasn't home, not really, but a borrowed space where gratitude was expected to outweigh any discomfort. I swallowed the unease and told her, "Thank you." My father had passed 2 years earlier, and though I wasn't sure what had possessed her to open her doors to us, I accepted because there were no other options left. Inside, everything looked familiar, yet strangely different. The living room carried that faint smell of lavender she always used. The same oak furniture I had dusted as a teenager still sat in place, but now there were framed photos of my sister Indira and her son decorating every corner. Avon and Zinnia looked around curiously, their eyes catching on those pictures. Neither of them said a word, but I felt their silence settle like a stone in my chest. Later that evening, when the kids unpacked their things in the small room she'd cleared for them, I walked through the hallway to find Seraphine in the kitchen. She moved with her usual precision, stirring a pot on the stove. I offered to help, but she waved me away. "You must be tired after those hospital shifts. Just sit." She spoke as though she were doing me a favor, not realizing how many hours I worked just to keep things afloat. I told her I was grateful, because I was, but something in her tone made it clear that this arrangement came at a price. It reminded me of that American saying I had once read in a college book: "You can never go home again." The house was the same, but my place in it was not. The days that followed brought small but cutting reminders that Avon and Zinnia were guests, not family. Indira came by often with her baby, Lumen, and my mother's face lit up in ways I hadn't seen before. She fussed over him, showering Indira with praise for being such a devoted mother, though Indira barely knew how to hold a bottle without complaining. When Lumen cried, Seraphine rushed across the room as if a siren had gone off. Meanwhile, Avon and Zinnia learned quickly to stay out of the way. They whispered to me at night in their room, asking why Grandma seemed different with them than with their cousin. I brushed their hair back and told them not to worry, but deep down I was already worried enough for all of us. At one dinner, I remember Seraphine telling Indira, "You were always so mature, even as a little girl. And now Lumen, he has your spark." She turned to me briefly, adding, "Sadie, I don't know how you manage with those long shifts, but children need more than just a roof." I bit my tongue, choosing not to argue. Maya Angelou's words ran through my head. When people show you who they are, believe them the first time. I had ignored so many signs as a child. I would not ignore them now. But the real wound came a few weeks later, on the evening of Avon and Zinnia's birthday. I had picked up a small cake from the bakery on my way home from the hospital, simple chocolate with white frosting and their names scrawled in blue and pink. I lit the candles and called everyone into the dining room. The kids leaned forward, their faces glowing in the candlelight. Then Seraphine's phone rang. It was Indira. Without hesitation, she announced, "We'll have to do this later. Indira is stopping by with the baby." She blew out the match in her hand and started clearing plates before the children could even make a wish. I froze, staring at the flickering candles. The frosting began to melt under the heat, sliding down the sides in glossy trails. Avon sat back in his chair, silent, while Zinnia whispered, "Are we not special enough, Mom?" Her voice was so small I almost didn't hear it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell my mother that birthdays mattered, that children remember every slight, that this moment would not just disappear. But instead, I reached out and pulled my daughter close. "You are special," I said softly. "Don't you ever forget that." We sat there as the candles burned themselves out, untouched. I swallowed the lump in my throat, refusing to let them see me break. Dignity sometimes meant saying nothing, even when every part of you wanted to shout. That night, when I tucked them into bed, I thought of how American families often treat birthdays as sacred, a time to show love and attention. To deny that was not just neglect, it was erasure. I kissed their foreheads and promised myself that this would be the last time they felt less than anyone else. Lying awake later, I began forming a plan. Every slight would be remembered, every humiliation documented in my mind. I would save, I would work longer shifts if I had to, and I would build a life for my children where they never again questioned their worth. My mother thought this was temporary, that I would remain grateful and small. But I knew better. I was a pediatric nurse, a woman who had handled life and death decisions at 3 a.m. I knew how to endure, and I knew how to fight in silence until the right moment came. There's a proverb I recalled that night. "Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me." I would not allow a second time. As the house grew quiet, I looked at the melted cake in the trash and the empty dining room. Something inside me shifted, a fire I hadn't felt in years catching hold. As the candles flickered out that night, something inside me lit up instead. An unshakable fire. The morning after the forgotten birthday lingered in my mind like a bruise. I woke early, before the kids, and walked into the living room, hoping that the quiet of dawn would give me a moment to steady myself. The house was hushed, the first light of spring slipping through the blinds, glinting off the framed photographs lining the walls. At first glance, the room seemed warm, almost welcoming, but the longer I stood there, the more I noticed what was missing. Every frame held a picture of Lumen, his first smile, his first steps, him wrapped in a tiny blanket while Indira beamed beside him. My eyes searched instinctively for Avon's science fair ribbon, Zinnia's soccer team photo, or even the class pictures I'd given my mother the year before. None of them were there. I opened a drawer in the sideboard, and there they were, stacked carelessly, frames pressed against each other, dust beginning to gather. My children's memories were hidden away like clutter, while Lumen's image was celebrated on every wall. I closed the drawer quietly, pressing my palm against it for a moment, as if that would stop the ache spreading in my chest. When the children padded into the room, rubbing sleep from their eyes, Zinnia paused in front of the wall. She frowned slightly. "Why are there only pictures of him, Mom?" she asked softly, glancing up at me. I crouched down and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "Sometimes people forget what's important," I said. "But it doesn't mean you're any less loved." Avon nodded, though his eyes lingered on the photographs longer than his sisters did. In American homes, the walls often tell the story of who belongs. Family portraits, graduations, birthdays, they are little shrines of love. Here, the story was rewritten, and my children were edited out. I decided then not to confront my mother immediately. I would take note, stay quiet, and wait. Not every battle should be fought the moment it appears. That evening, Seraphine called us all to the table. The smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filled the air, and the table was set more formally than usual. Indira and Narina arrived carrying Lumen, who was bundled in a pale blue blanket. My mother's face lit up as though royalty had arrived. She fussed over him, took him from Narina's arms, and cooed loudly enough to drown out the children's attempts at conversation. "Look at this boy," Seraphine beamed, rocking him gently. "He's so sharp already, just like Indira was when she was little." She laughed, recalling some childhood story about Indira's first words and how quickly she had learned to read. Then her gaze shifted briefly to my children, who were quietly pushing food around their plates. "Avon and Zinnia," she added with a shrug. "Well, they look more like their father." The words fell heavy between us. Avon froze, fork halfway to his mouth, before setting it back down. Zinnia kept her eyes lowered, stabbing at her carrots but not eating them. I clenched my jaw, willing myself not to speak out. My children didn't need a scene, they needed dignity. But inside, my heart boiled. To dismiss them so casually, to remind them of a father who was no longer part of our lives, was cruel. Indira shifted uncomfortably, glancing at me but saying nothing. Narina smirked faintly, as though enjoying the spectacle. I pressed my hand gently over Zinnia's, giving her a reassuring squeeze. She looked up at me, her eyes shimmering, and I forced a smile that masked my fury. In that moment, I remembered Eleanor Roosevelt's words. No one can make you feel inferior without your consent. I repeated them in my mind, like a shield. I would not let my mother's poison seep into my children's hearts. After dinner, I tucked the kids into bed. Zinnia whispered, "Why did Grandma say that?" Her voice was heavy with confusion. "Because sometimes people don't see clearly," I said gently. "But you and your brother shine brighter than any words could dim." She gave a small nod, and Avon turned toward the wall, silent, but I saw the tension in his shoulders. Lying awake later, I thought about the pattern repeating itself. Indira had always been the golden child, given more freedom, more praise, more support. I had been the one expected to be responsible, quiet, invisible. Now, the same script was being handed to my children, with Lumen cast as the star. Generational favoritism isn't just unfair, it's corrosive. It eats at self-worth until you start to believe you were always meant to be less. I had spent years unlearning that lesson, and I would not allow Avon and Zinnia to carry that burden forward. I began, in the privacy of my mind, to record everything. The missing photos, the birthday that dissolved into nothing, the casual comments at dinner, all of it became evidence. Not for a courtroom, but for the day when the truth needed to be undeniable. Sometimes, I whispered to myself, not reacting is the loudest response. My silence wasn't surrender, it was strategy. The next morning, as we sat eating cereal, Avon asked me directly, "Mom, why aren't there any pictures of us out there?" His voice was steady but wounded. I reached over and touched his cheek. "Our worth isn't measured by walls, sweetheart. I can't stop Grandma from rewriting her story, but I promise you, we'll write ours in stone somewhere else." They smiled faintly, comforted more by the conviction in my voice than the words themselves. Inside, though, I knew the storm was building. Every erasure was a warning of something bigger to come, and I could already feel the thunder on the horizon. I thought the missing photos were the worst of it, but my mother was just getting started. The weeks after that painful dinner blurred into a rhythm of work, chores, and carefully measured silence. But inside, the unease festered. Each time my mother's voice rose in delight for Lumen, each time Indira received another round of praise, I felt the old wounds of my childhood stir awake. As I walked past the hallway one afternoon, carrying laundry, I caught a glimpse of the spare room where Indira's things were stored for her visits. It was spacious, bright, and carefully decorated by my mother. The contrast to the cramped room Avon and Zinnia shared made my stomach tighten. I was transported back to when I was 10 years old. My sister had been given the larger bedroom, with the big window and a bookshelf lined with dolls and books our mother bought her. I, the eldest, was told to be responsible and accept the smaller room at the back of the house, the one with barely enough light to read by. I can still remember sitting on that narrow bed, listening to the hum of the air conditioner, wondering why being obedient and reliable meant being invisible. That memory pressed hard against the present. Watching my children live through the same diminishing treatment cut deeper than any insult aimed at me. I thought of Mark Twain's words I once read in a worn paperback. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The rhyme was too sharp to ignore. The cycle was clear. Favoritism had marked my life, and now it was reaching for Avon and Zinnia. I couldn't let it define them as it had once defined me. One Saturday, I planned something simple but meaningful, a small celebration for Zinnia's achievement at school. She had won an award for her science project, and I wanted her to feel seen. We set the table with snacks and lemonade, and I baked cookies despite the exhaustion clinging to me from the hospital. Avon arranged balloons he'd begged from a neighbor, and Zinnia changed into her favorite yellow dress, her face alight with anticipation. But just as the clock struck 4 and the children asked when Grandma would come down, Seraphine's phone buzzed. I watched her face shift as she answered. "Oh, Indira is dropping by with Lumen," she said into the receiver. Then she turned to me with a smile that masked no guilt. "We'll have to put this off. The baby's coming, and we should focus on him." I froze. My hands, still dusted with flour, trembled slightly as I set the plate down. Avon and Zinnia sat at the table, the balloons bobbing gently above them, the cookies untouched. They waited, their eyes flicking toward the doorway, as if someone might still walk through. Minutes stretched into an hour. No one came. The lemonade grew warm, the cookies stale on the plate. Zinnia finally looked up at me, her voice small but piercing. "Do we even matter here, Mom?" Her words sliced through me. I felt tears pressing against the corners of my eyes, but I swallowed them down. The last thing I would allow was for my children to see me break. I pulled her close, kissed the top of her head, and whispered, "You matter more than anything." Avon sat quietly, staring at the balloons. He didn't speak, but his silence was louder than any accusation. This moment mirrored too many of my own as a child. The birthdays postponed, the promises forgotten, the milestones overshadowed by Indira's needs. The rhyme of history thundered in my ears. That night, when the children finally slept, I sat alone in the living room, pen in hand. I opened a small journal I had begun keeping quietly. I recorded the canceled celebration in detail, the date, the words my mother had said, the look on my daughter's face. This was not weakness. This was preparation. In toxic families, silence is sometimes survival. I reminded myself of an American phrase I had carried with me since college: pick your battles. I was picking mine carefully. Writing down the incident steadied me. It wasn't just about keeping track. It was about refusing to let the truth be erased. One day, when the time came to speak, I would have every detail etched clearly. The effort of protecting Avon and Zinnia from internalizing these slights was heavy. It meant constant reassurance, constant reminders that their worth was not tied to their grandmother's words or actions. It meant choosing silence, not because I lacked courage, but because I needed to bide my time. I looked around the house at the framed pictures of Lumen that lined the shelves and let the bitterness settle into something sharper: determination. The next morning, as I prepared breakfast, Avon pushed his cereal bowl away and looked at me seriously. "Why does Grandma always cancel things for him?" he asked. I met his gaze. "Because she doesn't see clearly," I said. "But I do, and I promise you, your worth isn't decided by how much space someone gives you at their table." Zinnia nodded, her small hand reaching across the table to squeeze mine. That day, as the sun sank and the house grew quiet again, I made a vow. The cycle would end with me. My children would never grow up believing they were less. Every slight, every dismissal would be fuel for our escape, our future. I thought of my own loneliness as a child, the countless times I wished someone had fought for me. That memory hardened into resolve. "If I had no one to fight for me back then," I whispered to the dark, "my kids will never know that same loneliness." I thought I had made peace with my past, but watching it unfold again in front of my children made me realize I could never stay silent forever. The weight of every unspoken slight had begun to press down on me like stones collected in my pockets. Each quiet dismissal, every photo of my children tucked away in a drawer, every moment where Zinnia's questions went unanswered, it all built into something heavier than words. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, I sat across from my mother in the living room. The glow of the lamp fell across her sharp features, and I tried, cautiously, to open a door of honesty. "Mom," I said quietly, choosing my words with care. "The kids can feel it when they're being left out. They notice things." She looked up from her knitting, lips pressed thin, and sighed as though I had just reminded her of something trivial. "Sadie, you're too sensitive. They're children. They'll be fine." Her dismissal landed like a slap. It wasn't just my children she erased with those words. It was me. My instincts as their mother, my perspective, my reality. In her eyes, I was not just overly emotional, but irrelevant. I leaned back, swallowing the sting. When someone shows you disrespect, they're teaching you how to treat them. That phrase ran through my head like a warning bell. My mother had been teaching me that lesson all my life, and now she was passing it to my children. The bitterness pooled in my chest, but I said nothing more that night. I tucked the moment away, adding it to the growing list of injustices I carried silently. The real blow came on a Sunday afternoon, while she was folding laundry at the kitchen counter. Indira had dropped by, and the room hummed with chatter about Lumen's milestones. Seraphine turned to me casually and said, "Indira is new at being a mom. She needs help. You're used to it by now." I froze. The words sank into me like ice water. 2 years of single parenting, nights spent awake with sick children, endless shifts at the hospital, mornings dragging myself from bed to make sure lunches were packed and homework checked, all of it dismissed in one offhand sentence. "Mom," I said carefully, keeping my voice calm, though my pulse hammered in my ears. "I've been doing this alone for years. That's not nothing." She didn't even pause. She folded another towel, smoothed the edges, and said flatly, "Well, you chose that life." I felt something sharp rise in me, a mixture of anger and disbelief. I chose to care for my children, yes, but that doesn't make me less deserving of respect. She finally looked at me, her eyes narrowing. "Respect is earned, Sadie, and you're here because you need me." Her words cut deeper than any I'd heard before. To erase my sacrifices, to imply that motherhood was only valid when supported by her approval, it hollowed something inside me. Rage trembled beneath the surface, but I held it down. For my children, I could not allow that rage to spill into a shouting match they would hear from the next room. The following week, her disapproval sharpened into humiliation. At dinner, we sat around the table, Indira, Narina, the kids, and my mother presiding over us all. The conversation turned to groceries. Seraphine cleared her throat, her voice rising just enough to carry across the room. "Sadie, you hand me your receipts this week?" she asked. I hesitated. "I've already covered most of it. The kids needed—" She cut me off, her voice booming with finality. "You and those kids are just living off me. If you don't like it, there's the door." The room went still. Avon's fork clattered against his plate. Zinnia's eyes widened, filling with unshed tears. Heat rushed to my face. I wanted to shout, to tell her how dare she, to remind her that I worked 12-hour shifts to provide, that I paid my share of food and utilities, that dignity was worth more than this endless belittling. But the sight of my children's stricken faces pulled the words back into my throat. Instead, I placed my fork down gently and breathed. "Every receipt I hand over is one step closer to freedom," I told myself. I would not let her see me break. I would let her think she'd won, even as I was already planning her defeat. After dinner, I went to my room and pulled out a shoebox. I began sliding every receipt into it: groceries, school supplies, medical copays, everything. It wasn't just financial proof. It was a record of my endurance. Each slip of paper was a tally mark of my effort, my quiet rebellion. I reminded myself of another saying I once read on a bulletin board in the hospital lounge. Strength grows in the moments when you think you can't go on, but you keep going anyway. My silence was not surrender, it was strategy. I thought I had heard the worst of her words, but soon, it wouldn't just be words she used against us. I came home late that evening, my scrubs still smelling faintly of antiseptic and exhaustion clinging to me like a second skin. My feet ached from 12 hours on the pediatric floor, but all I wanted was to see Avon and Zinnia, maybe sit with them for a few minutes before bed. As I set my keys on the counter, I noticed something stacked by the stairwell. Boxes. My children's boxes. Their posters rolled tight and shoved into a corner, books tossed in carelessly, toys piled on top like clutter ready for storage. "What is this?" I asked, my voice tight. My mother appeared from the hallway, arms folded, her expression calm as though nothing out of the ordinary had happened. "Lumen needs the upstairs bedroom," she said evenly. "It's only fair." I looked back at the stairwell, then up at the landing where Avon and Zinnia's small room had been. "You moved them?" My voice cracked between disbelief and fury. "They'll be fine in the basement," she replied. "It's practical." Avon stood nearby, clutching a stuffed bear, his voice barely audible. "Why don't we belong upstairs, Mom?" I knelt beside him, my throat burning. "You do belong, sweetheart. You belong anywhere love lives." But in that moment, with their belongings stripped from their room, it felt like love had been buried beneath the floorboards. The humiliation of watching my children cast down, both literally and symbolically, gnawed at me. My mother had not only diminished me as a parent, but she had dragged my children into her hierarchy. We weren't family anymore. We were tenants, shuffled below. When I led them downstairs, the air grew heavier. The basement smelled of damp cement, faint mildew clinging to the corners. A single bulb flickered overhead, illuminating boxes of forgotten furniture, old coats draped on racks, memories my mother no longer valued. I set the boxes down and looked around. This was where my children were expected to sleep, to play, to grow. Upstairs, a new nursery gleamed with fresh paint and expensive toys, everything carefully chosen for Lumen's comfort. Seraphine's voice followed me down the stairs. "The baby is younger, Sadie. He deserves the best. Your kids are older. They'll manage." Zinnia turned, her eyes flashing. "We're not babies, but we're still family." Her voice cracked, brave yet trembling. I pulled her close, her small shoulders shaking. "I know, darling," I whispered. "I know." I looked at my mother, standing at the top of the stairs like a judge, her decision final. I bit back every word I wanted to hurl at her, choosing instead to vow silently, this will be the last time they're pushed aside without consequence. Later that night, as we unpacked boxes in the dim basement light, Avon tugged at my sleeve. "Mom, look," he said, holding up a drawing. It was a family picture. Me, Avon, Zinnia, all drawn in crayon with wide smiles. "I made this for Grandma's living room," he explained softly. But she put up another picture of Lumen instead. He had taped the drawing to the basement wall, the crayon colors dull against the concrete. The sight hollowed me out. In so many American homes, children's artwork is pinned proudly to refrigerators, displayed as trophies of love. Here, my son's creation was banished to the basement, hidden like an afterthought. "Mom," he asked quietly, "do we even count in her family picture?" I cupped his face gently, fighting the sting in my chest. "You will always count. Don't let anyone's walls tell you otherwise." That night, after tucking them into makeshift beds in the basement, I sat alone, staring at the shadows pooling in the corners. Anger simmered inside me, not the kind that explodes, but the kind that calcifies into resolve. I began to calculate silently. How many more shifts I needed, how much I had saved, how far we were from freedom. I thought of Brené Brown's words I had read once. Anger is often what pain looks like when it shows itself in public. My pain was sharp, but I would not give it to my mother as a performance. Instead, I folded it inward into strategy. Each dollar, each receipt, each humiliation was another stone in the foundation of our escape. "One day soon," I whispered into the still basement air, "my kids will walk upstairs into a home that belongs to us." But before that day came, my mother would find new ways to prove just how far she'd go to erase us. Dinner that evening was meant to be ordinary. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, and the familiar creak of the old dining chairs as we settled around the table. Indira and Narina had brought Lumen, who was dressed in a sailor outfit, and my mother's face glowed with pride as she held him close. A family friend, Vera Klein, had been invited as well. She had known my mother for years and often praised her as a model grandmother. The conversation drifted from Lumen's new words to Indira's latest business venture. My mother raised her glass and declared, "This boy, he's my true grandson, the one who carries our name forward." She gestured toward Lumen, cradled in Indira's lap. Then, with a dismissive flick of her hand, she added, "The other kids, well, they're just Sadies." The words landed like stones dropped into water, rippling through the silence that followed. My fork paused halfway to my mouth. Across the table, Avon lowered his head, his shoulders curling inward. Zinnia clenched her fists beneath the tablecloth, her jaw set tight. Vera looked startled but said nothing, sipping her wine to cover the awkwardness. I wanted to speak, to call my mother out, but my voice stayed trapped. My children's humiliation had been laid bare in front of strangers, and I knew that anything I said would only deepen the wound. Instead, I whispered silently to myself, "Sometimes, dignity is saying nothing when the truth is loud enough." The rest of dinner passed with strained conversation, every laugh forced, every smile brittle. Avon pushed his peas across his plate, Zinnia barely touched her food, and I excused us as soon as politeness allowed. The very next afternoon, the wound was reopened in the most public way yet. I was out in the front yard trimming the hedges when neighbor Ophelie Rhodes stopped by. She leaned on the fence, smiling warmly at Avon, who was showing her a small model rocket he had built for a school project. "That's impressive, young man," she said kindly. "You must be proud of him, Sadie." Before I could answer, my mother appeared on the porch. She looked down at us and interjected, "Well, that's fine, but Indira was always the real achiever in this family, just like her son will be." She nodded toward the baby, who gurgled in Indira's arms inside the house. Ophelie's smile faltered, her eyes darting to me. She quickly mumbled an excuse and left, her expression stiff with discomfort. I turned to see Avon's face pale, the rocket sagging in his hand. His pride, just beginning to blossom, had been cut down with a single sentence. The humiliation wasn't just private anymore. It was laid out under the open sky for others to witness. Later that evening, as I tucked them into bed, Zinnia whispered, "Why does she always say we're not enough?" Her voice cracked, and I could see the tears she tried to hide. I pulled her close. "You are more than enough." Don't let her words tell you otherwise. But inside, I was seething. Public humiliation cuts deeper than any private insult. When grandparents, who are supposed to be anchors of pride, become sources of shame, the betrayal is magnified. I thought of a line I once read by Lena Horne. "It's not the load that breaks you down, it's the way you carry it." I carried it quietly, holding the shame in my chest and turning it into something steadier. I told myself I couldn't stop her tongue, but I could control my response. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone to bed. I began to see a path forward. If my mother's cruelty could wound so deeply in silence, perhaps it could also reveal itself when others were watching. Shame only works when it stays hidden in the dark. Once others see it, the shame belongs not to the victim, but to the one who created it. I started noting which neighbors noticed, which friends raised an eyebrow, who seemed unsettled. Quietly, I was building not only a plan to leave, but also a readiness to confront. I wasn't just preparing to escape anymore. I was preparing to stand up. I whispered to myself, "One day, her words will not silence me. They will expose her." But my silence was about to be tested, because soon, my children wouldn't stay silent either. It started with something small, the kind of moment that wouldn't have drawn attention under normal circumstances. Lumen sat in the living room surrounded by shiny new toys, each wrapped in colorful packaging with bows still tied. My mother had given them to him the week before, making a show of how much she invested in her true grandson. Zinnia wandered in, curious. Her eyes landed on a puzzle spread across the floor, one she had always loved working on. She picked up a piece and knelt beside Lumen. Before she could place it, Seraphine's voice rang out sharp. "Let him have it, Zinnia. He's special." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. My daughter's cheeks flushed, but instead of shrinking away, she straightened. She held the puzzle piece firmly and replied, "We're family too." The room froze. My mother's knitting needles stilled in her lap, her face hardening into something cold. Indira's eyes flicked to me, half amused, half cautious. Avon looked from his sister to me, wide-eyed. Inside, pride swelled so fiercely it nearly drowned my fear. For the first time, Zinnia had pushed back against the current that tried to sweep her away. Yet fear coiled too, because I knew my mother never tolerated defiance without retaliation. "I won't argue with a child," Seraphine finally said, her voice tight. "But respect needs to be taught." Zinnia dropped the puzzle piece back on the floor, her jaw set. She turned to sit beside Avon, her small shoulders stiff but unbroken. I caught her eye and gave the faintest nod, a silent message. I saw her, I was proud, and she wasn't alone. The retaliation came sooner than I expected. A few days later, as I came in with grocery bags straining my arms, my mother was waiting at the table with a ledger open. "Let me see your receipts," she demanded. I set the bags down carefully. "Mom, I've already paid for what the kids need this week." "You're careless with money," she shot back. "If you'd listened to me, you wouldn't be in this position." Indira and Narina were in the kitchen, sipping coffee like spectators waiting for the show. Zinnia and Avon hovered near the doorway, sensing the tension. "I work for every dollar I spend," I said evenly, pulling the receipts from my purse. 12-hour shifts, double weekends. Nothing here is wasted." She snatched the slips from my hand, scanning them with exaggerated disapproval. "Cereal? Snacks? Do you think children need all this? You're indulging them when you can't even provide a proper home." The words sliced at me, not because I believed them, but because they were spoken loud enough for my children to hear. Avon shifted uncomfortably, and Zinnia's fists curled at her sides. Narina chuckled under her breath, a sound like kindling catching fire. Indira smirked into her coffee. I drew a breath. "I don't need your approval for how I feed my kids. What I do need is respect." Her eyes narrowed. "Respect? From me? You're living in my house. Don't forget that." I clenched my teeth but held my composure. Humiliation flushed through me, but underneath it, a steel resolve was hardening. Ayn Rand's words echoed in my mind. "Money is only a tool. It will take you wherever you wish, but it will not replace you as the driver." I would drive. Quietly, strategically, but I would. That night, after the children had gone to bed, I pulled out a spiral notebook and began taping receipts into it, one by one. Every purchase, every expense was logged with care. I wasn't just keeping track for myself, I was building a narrative my children could look back on, proof of the unseen labor that kept us afloat. As I pressed the tape down, Avon padded into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "Mom?" he asked softly. "Why do you keep all those papers?" I looked at him and smiled, weary but firm. "Because one day, they'll show who really carried this family." He nodded slowly, not fully understanding, but enough to feel the weight of it. He hugged me before shuffling back to bed. Late into the night, I sat searching online for small apartments in Houston. Prices glared back at me, daunting, but not impossible. I calculated hours, shifts, savings, and whispered to myself that freedom had a number, and I would reach it. The next morning, I found Zinnia whispering with her brother in their basement corner. "Why does Grandma only care about him?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Avon shrugged, his eyes clouded. I knelt beside them. "Listen to me," I said gently. "Sometimes people choose favorites. That doesn't make you less. You are worth more than the space anyone gives you. Don't ever forget that." Their eyes met mine, searching for reassurance. I gave it not just with words, but with the conviction in my tone. That night, as I closed the notebook of receipts, I noticed a new page. Taped carefully beside the grocery slips was Zinnia's drawing, a picture of our family, the three of us holding hands. She had slipped it in without telling me, as though silently joining the rebellion I had been waging. Bittersweet pride swelled inside me. My children weren't just enduring, they were awakening. But our quiet rebellion wasn't enough, because soon my mother would force a confrontation I could no longer avoid. The day began like so many others, with me coming home from another shift at the hospital. My body ached, but it was the sight that greeted me at the bottom of the stairs that left me unable to breathe. Avon and Zinnia were curled on their beds in the basement, their faces wet with tears. The room smelled damp, the air stale, the faint light of a single bulb making their shadows look even smaller than they were. "Mom!" Avon choked, sitting up. "Grandma said this isn't our space anymore. She said this is Lumen's house now." Zinnia's voice followed, sharp with pain. "She moved our things again. She said we don't belong upstairs." My heart clenched as though gripped by a fist. I looked around. Boxes shoved against the wall, toys scattered like discarded pieces of their lives. It wasn't enough that they had been sent to the basement once. My mother had made it clear they were less, over and over. For a long moment, I stood frozen, watching my children sob. Every part of me screamed to shout, to storm upstairs and tear down every frame of Lumen's face. But instead, I felt something shift inside. My jaw tightened, and slowly, deliberately, I smiled. It wasn't a smile of joy. It was cold, deliberate, the kind of smile that said the time for endurance had passed. I remembered something I once read. Sometimes the most powerful scream is silence. That night, I let the scream echo in my chest, wordless, carried only by the curl of my lips. The following week, proof of what my mother had done spilled into daylight. I was sweeping near the porch when the neighbor, Ophalie Rhodes, stopped by. She leaned over the railing, peering into the basement window where Avon and Zinnia were quietly doing homework. "Sadie," she asked innocently, "why are the kids down there?" Before I could respond, Seraphine's voice floated from the doorway. "The upstairs is for Lumen," she said without hesitation. "He deserves better." Ophalie blinked, her smile faltering. "But aren't they your grandchildren too?" "They'll manage," Seraphine answered briskly, as if the matter required no further discussion. Silence stretched heavy between us. Ophalie glanced at me, eyes wide with disbelief, before excusing herself and hurrying away. I knew at that moment the shame had spread beyond our walls. What had once been whispered in corners was now visible in daylight, undeniable. I thought to myself, shame, when exposed to daylight, stains the one who spreads it. For the first time, I felt the balance tilt. Not enough to change everything, but enough to plant a seed. That night, I found myself sitting alone again at the kitchen table, pen poised over my notebook. But instead of simply taping receipts or writing down events, I thought like a strategist. My children's tears had become fuel, hardening into resolve. I thought of every detail I had gathered: the missing photos, the canceled birthday, the basement, the cruel words spoken in front of others. I thought of neighbors like Ophalie, who had seen enough to know the truth. I thought of the whispers already circulating, and how small cracks could widen into fractures if pushed at the right moment. "Pick your moment," I whispered to myself. "Timing is everything." In America, we are taught to measure power not by who yells loudest, but by who waits long enough to strike when it matters. I had been biding my time for months, and now, more than ever, I knew the moment was drawing near. When I went back downstairs, Avon looked up at me, his eyes searching. Zinnia sat quietly by her brother's side, her face tired but steady. I knelt beside them and took their hands. "One day," I promised, "we won't live like guests in someone else's house. We'll have our own place, and you'll never be told where you don't belong again." Zinnia frowned. "But when, Mom?" I brushed her cheek. "Soon, and when it happens, it will be because we never stopped believing we deserved it." As I tucked them into bed, I turned off the light and felt the cold smile tugging at my lips again. It wasn't warmth. It was certainty. I whispered to the darkness. I didn't raise my children to beg for love. I raised them to know their worth. And in that recognition, I saw the truth clearly. My silence wasn't weakness. It was the weapon I had sharpened, waiting for the day to use it. And when the moment came, my mother would never see it coming, because I had learned to smile before I struck. For months, I had been moving in silence, recording, saving, collecting. Receipts tucked into a shoebox, notes scrawled in the margins of a battered notebook, photos snapped quickly on my phone when no one was looking. I taped Zinnia's drawing into the pages, logged the night her celebration was canceled, wrote down the words my mother had said about us being guests. To an outsider, it might have looked obsessive, but to me, it was survival. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. I'd learned long ago that in families like mine, truth had a way of being twisted, rewritten by whoever shouted loudest. My mother excelled at that, but paper, ink, and time, they didn't lie. Documentation is the first step toward liberation, I reminded myself each night as I closed the notebook. I cataloged each humiliation, not to dwell in bitterness, but to build a record strong enough to stand when my silence finally ended. The storm broke one evening at dinner. My mother sat at the head of the table, Indira and Narina at her sides, while Avon and Zinnia picked at their plates. Conversations circled around the usual, Indira's projects, Lumen's milestones. Then my mother's voice sharpened, carrying above the clink of silverware. "You should all remember," she said, her gaze sweeping the table. "Everything in this house, everything on this table exists because of me. Sadie may stay here, but she doesn't contribute the way she should. Without me, you'd have nothing." The words landed like a gavel. My children's eyes dropped, and Indira smirked. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but instead of shrinking, I reached under my chair and pulled up a thick folder. Calmly, I set it on the table and opened it. "Every bag of groceries," I said evenly, laying out receipt after receipt. "Every bill I paid, every expense I covered. It's all here. More weight than you've ever admitted I carry." The room went silent. Indira shifted in her seat, exchanging a glance with Narina, their smirks faltering. My mother's eyes flicked over the pages, her jaw tightening. "This doesn't prove anything," she muttered. "It proves enough," I countered, sliding the papers toward her. "It proves that I am not living off you. I've been holding this family together in ways you've chosen not to see." For once, the table had no comeback. My children watched, wide-eyed, their faces shifting from shame to something closer to awe. Vindication coursed through me, steady and cold. But I wasn't done. From the folder, I pulled one last document, older, yellowed at the edges, but powerful. I smoothed it on the table, the ink clear enough to silence the room further. "This," I said, my voice quiet but cutting, "is the deed transfer. Before Dad passed, he gave me partial ownership of this house. Legally, this place was never yours alone." My mother's face drained of color, her lips parting soundlessly. The authority she had wielded for months, for years, cracked in an instant. Indira blinked, Narina sat back stunned, and my children leaned closer, trying to grasp the significance. I looked directly at my mother. "This home wasn't yours to wield as a weapon. It was always part mine. And you knew it." Silence stretched, the only sound the faint tick of the kitchen clock. Justice didn't roar. It unfolded in ink on paper, undeniable and permanent. I sat back, refusing to gloat. I don't need to shout. The truth speaks for itself. Across the table, Avon's eyes lit with pride, and Zinnia straightened in her chair. They saw me not as someone beaten down, but as someone who had carried strength all along, waiting for the right moment to reveal it. I framed it not as revenge, but as reclaiming dignity. My children needed to know that survival wasn't about cowering. It was about knowing when to strike. But even as I closed the folder, I knew this wasn't the end. The look in my mother's eyes told me she wouldn't surrender easily. Control had been her weapon for too long, and she would not let it slip without a fight. I thought exposing the truth would be the end of the battle, but for my mother, it was only the beginning of war. The dining table had never felt heavier. Plates of food sat untouched, the clatter of silverware replaced by an undercurrent of unease that hummed through the air. My mother sat at the head of the table, her eyes sharp, her jaw set. Indira and Narina flanked her like silent guards, while Avon and Zinnia shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. The memory of the documents I had unveiled weeks earlier, the receipts, the deed, still lingered between us, though no one dared to speak of it. My mother cleared her throat, her tone deliberate. "Let me remind you all," she began. "This house stands because of me. Whatever Sadie thinks she's proven, she and her children are here by my goodwill. And goodwill can run out." I felt my children's eyes on me, searching for reassurance. I breathed steadily, letting the tension coil before releasing my response. I reached for the folder I had kept close by and laid it gently on the table. "You wanted to erase us," I said evenly, opening the deed for all to see once more. "But this house carries my name too." Gasps fluttered across the table. Indira stiffened. Narina leaned forward as if she had misheard. My mother's face flushed with fury. "You think a piece of paper makes you strong?" she spat. I allowed myself a small, cold smile. "The truth is like a lion. You don't have to defend it. Let it loose, it will defend itself. For the first time in years, I saw her falter, her authority cracking under the weight of ink and fact. The fallout was immediate. Indira set her fork down with a sharp clink. So, all those times you said you carried everything. She trailed off, unable to finish. Narina looked away, cheeks red with embarrassment. This doesn't change anything, my mother snapped. You're ungrateful. Everything I've done, every sacrifice, I did for you. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm. Gratitude is not slavery. I can appreciate what you've given without surrendering my dignity. The words settled over the table, heavy as stone. My children straightened in their chairs, their faces brightening with something I hadn't seen in months, pride. They were witnessing a shift in power, a moment when the balance tilted in our favor. You've embarrassed this family, my mother hissed, her voice trembling. No, I replied softly. You've embarrassed yourself. The weeks that followed turned whispers into wildfire. Word spread quickly in the neighborhood, stories of how Seraphine had tried to evict her own grandchildren but lost control of the very house she lorded over. At the grocery store, I overheard women murmuring near the produce aisle. Can you believe it? She tried to push her own daughter out, and it backfired. On walks with the children, neighbors greeted me differently. Some gave knowing nods, others offered words of quiet support. The truth had seeped beyond our walls, and it was no longer mine alone to carry. Ophalie Rhodes, who had seen the basement with her own eyes, confirmed it to anyone who asked. I saw where she kept those kids, she said firmly to a group on the corner. No child should be treated like that. My mother's reputation, once pristine, crumbled. In our community, respect was currency, and hers had gone bankrupt. At home, I noticed the shift. Invitations stopped coming for her. Calls were left unanswered. Where once she stood as a matriarch admired by her peers, she now stood alone, surrounded by whispers she couldn't silence. And yet, amid her downfall, I found no joy in gloating. One evening, as the children and I sat in the living room, Zinnia leaned against me and whispered, Mom, you didn't even have to yell. I kissed the top of her head, my voice steady. Strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits. Sometimes it simply shows the truth. I reflected quietly. Power isn't always seized with fists or loud battles. Sometimes it's claimed with patience, with silence, with the right piece of paper at the right time. All those nights of recording, of swallowing my words, of biting my tongue, they had led here. But even as I savored the victory, I knew scars remained. My mother's silence in the days after wasn't surrender, it was calculation. I could feel it in the way she looked at me, not defeated but simmering, plotting. I thought her silence meant defeat, but in truth, it was the silence before her storm. The house was quiet the morning I decided it was time. The gossip outside, the fury that lingered in my mother's eyes, the way my children carried themselves more cautiously each day. It all told me what I already knew. Staying here any longer would break us. I moved carefully, not in a rush, but with the kind of steady certainty that comes after months of hesitation. I pulled out the old duffel bags from the closet and began folding the children's clothes. Zinnia entered the room, holding her worn sketchbook. She looked at me for a long moment before walking to the basement wall where her artwork had hung, torn and ignored. She peeled one picture free, rolled it tightly, and tucked it into her backpack. This isn't just paper, I told her softly. These are pieces of who we are. No one can erase that. Upstairs, Avon rummaged in the sideboard and returned with the family photo I had once given my mother. It had been hidden away in a drawer. He held it close and asked, Mom, are we running away? I bent down, brushing his hair back. No, sweetheart. We're moving forward. The words steadied me as much as they steadied him. This house might have carried my name on paper, but it was never truly home. Every corner whispered reminders of battles fought, of dignity tested, of wounds reopened. Leaving was painful, but staying would have been worse. As the children gathered their things, my mother appeared at the door, fury etched in every line of her face. You're throwing this family away, she shouted. I stood tall, my bag slung over my shoulder. Family doesn't throw children into basements, I answered, my voice calm, even. Her eyes flashed. After all I've done for you, you'll walk out like this. You're ungrateful, Sadie. I met her gaze. Gratitude isn't submission. I can appreciate what you gave without letting you destroy us. The exchange grew louder as she hurled accusations, her words meant to wound. But I refused to argue. I let her fury wash over me like waves breaking against stone. I wouldn't return venom for venom. Turning to the children, I said clearly, "We're leaving." And with that, we stepped toward the door. The sound of our bags rolling across the floor was louder than any argument. My mother's voice rose behind us, but I didn't look back. Neighbors had gathered outside, pretending to busy themselves with rakes and mailboxes, but their eyes followed us. They knew enough of the truth. Some nodded quietly, others simply watched as we walked past. I held my head high, Zinnia and Avon at my sides. Sometimes the hardest step isn't into a fight, but out of one. The sound of the front door closing behind us was both an ending and a beginning. Holding on is believing there's only a past. Letting go is knowing there's a future. I thought of that quote as we walked down the driveway. The chill in the air bit at our cheeks, but my children's hands felt warm in mine. They no longer cried, their shoulders no longer slumped. They walked taller, each step a quiet declaration of freedom. We reached the sidewalk, and I paused to look at them. Avon carried the photo tucked safely in his bag. Zinnia clutched her rolled-up drawing. These weren't just objects, they were proof that we had survived, that even in neglect, our worth had never vanished. Later that evening, after we settled into a friend's spare apartment temporarily, I sat on the floor with them. I reflected aloud. I used to be the invisible daughter, the one overlooked. But today, I chose differently. I chose to protect us, not to repeat what was done to me. Zinnia leaned against me, whispering, "Mom, I'm proud of you." Tears pricked my eyes, but I smiled. I'm proud of us. For the first time in years, I felt no weight pressing me down. My mother's apology might never come, but I realized I no longer needed it. What mattered was in front of me, my children, whole and unbroken, looking at me not with pity, but with pride. We walked away with nothing but each other. But for the first time, it felt like everything we needed. Spring sunlight filtered through the curtains of our new apartment, soft and golden, warming the small living room. It wasn't big, and it wasn't grand, but it was ours. Boxes still lined the hallway, but the walls already carried life. Photographs of Avon and Zinnia hung proudly, their faces smiling back at me, no longer hidden in drawers. Zinnia's drawings were taped to the refrigerator, colorful bursts of her imagination filling the space with joy. Avon's family portrait, once relegated to the basement wall, now hung framed above the sofa. I stood there, taking it all in, and felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Zinnia looked around, clutching a pillow as she settled onto the couch. "Mom," she said softly, "this feels like home." I smiled, my chest tightening with emotion. "Because it is," I answered. The contrast to my mother's house struck me deeply. There, every corner whispered judgment and exclusion. Here, even in its modest size, every detail sang of belonging. This wasn't a mansion, but it was filled with dignity. Outside our walls, the story of my mother's downfall continued to spread. The neighborhood that once praised her now kept its distance. I heard from a friend that at the local church, whispers circled like wildfire. She drove her daughter and grandchildren away, they said, and then she lost the very house she used as a weapon. People avoided her at the store, stopped inviting her to gatherings. Reputation in our community was a kind of currency, and hers had collapsed. Ophalie Rhodes, who had seen the basement herself, confirmed what others had only suspected. "I saw where she kept them," she told neighbors firmly. "I saw the truth with my own eyes." No one questioned her after that. Indira and Narina tried to maintain their polished image, but the shine had dulled. When people looked at them, they didn't see success anymore. They saw privilege built on someone else's pain. Watching from a distance, I felt no triumph, only clarity. Vindication didn't always roar. Sometimes it came in the silence of others turning their backs on cruelty. Months later, I received a call from my mother. Her voice trembled with something I hadn't heard before: desperation. "Sadie," she said, "without you, this family feels broken." I closed my eyes, the ache of her words piercing, but I steadied myself. "It broke long before I left," I replied. "You should come back," she urged. "The children, they need their grandmother." I shook my head, though she couldn't see it. "My children need love, not a warden." The silence on the line was long, heavy. I ended the call knowing she hadn't reached out in love, but in fear of isolation. Walking away wasn't weakness, it was the strongest thing I'd ever done. I remembered a quote I once read: "Sometimes the only way to win is not to play their game," and I had stopped playing. That evening, sitting at the kitchen table with Avon and Zinnia, I listened to their laughter echoing off the walls. For once, the sound wasn't strained or cautious. It was free. "Mom," Zinnia said, her eyes sparkling, "do you think Grandma will ever say sorry?" I met her gaze gently. "Maybe, maybe not. But we don't need her apology to move forward. What we need is right here." Avon looked up from his sketch pad, his voice thoughtful. "You taught us that we decide who we are, not anyone else." I smiled, pride welling up. "Exactly. Never let anyone decide your worth, not even family." As the night settled, I reflected on the journey. The inheritance I had fought for wasn't the deed to a house or proof of groceries paid. It was freedom. Freedom from favoritism, from silence, from being erased. The cycle that had haunted me since childhood ended here. My children would never grow up believing they were less. I looked at them across the table, their laughter filling the room, and whispered to myself, the real inheritance I gave my children wasn't a house. It was freedom. And as I closed the chapter on my mother's house, I realized we hadn't lost a home. We had built one,